okay? Because I know what's going to happen. Now we're recording. In terms of rewriting the midterm, I will not allow you to rewrite the midterm if you simply email me and say, yeah, I want to rewrite my midterm. I won't do that. You have to explain to me, because I need to clarify this, this, and this, or I need to correct this, this, and this. Because the main problem I find with people who get an assignment like this, it isn't that they don't understand it, it's that they didn't even apply themselves. So what this is compelling you to do is actually go back after the fact and apply yourself and think, yeah, I should have done this work before. I'm willing to do it now. Here's why. It's not because I'm mean. I am mean, but that's not why we're doing this. It's because you won't be able to put together a case study if you don't first master this conceptual approach. It won't make any sense to you. It won't. Okay. This course is built that way. First, let's talk about things conceptually. Let's make sure that we refine our thinking. Not necessarily that we all agree, but that you've got a model in your head of what you understand empire and colonialism to be, so that when you talk about decolonization, you'll know what you're talking about in terms of what's being dismantled and probably why. Also, the thing I've emphasized all class, for empire, there are motives and there are capacities or opportunities, okay? Same thing with decolonization. What was the motive and what was the means? What were the opportunities for people to succeed at decolonization? That's what we're going to begin to talk about today. Now, if you want to rewrite your midterm, okay, then what we have to decide as a class right now, what is a fair amount of time to allow people to rewrite? You tell me. How many days should I give you? Because it's got to be, it's got to be a little bit of time, because you need to reread it. Most of you, I'm guaranteeing you, you need to go back and read the readings because you didn't do it. But in addition to that, what's a fair time? Cole, you got your hand up?
How about Sunday night? That's 5 days. That seems like a fair amount of time.
Does that seem fair?
Seems good.
Okay. All right. All right. We are recording this. I'm going to make a note because I made a note, let them decide. Okay. So let me cross. Well, no, I'll leave that there because I like my thinking, Okay. Due by Sunday at 11 p.m. Okay. Now, what I'd like you to do, this is kind of important because I don't trust Moodle. And sometimes, it gets glitchy when you submitted something and you try to resubmit it. I don't want anybody to run into that problem. Email it to me. Just email it to me. Okay. Now, what that means, though, is if a significant number of you do that, it's going to delay my ability to post grades for the midterm. Okay. But that's okay, because if you are concerned about your grade, all right, then and say, look, like, no, I worked hard on that. I think I nailed it. And a few of you nailed it. Don't worry about it. It's like, if I got an A or a B on that, that's pretty good. That's the best I can do. Then you can ask me, hey, Bill, instead of emailing me and asking me to rewrite it, you can say, can you go ahead, finalize the grade on this thing and let me know how I did? But if I did that, that's the grade you're stuck with. Okay. So we're negotiating a little bit because, again, this is the purpose of the assignment. It's not just to hang a letter grade on you. It's to make sure that before you go much further, we've got you comfortable with the stuff we covered in the first 4 weeks. Okay? Otherwise, man, you're going to hit week 8 and you're not going to know what you're doing. You're going to panic and you're going to be all anxious and everything else. And, that's not going to be any fun. And then you'll drink too much beer as opposed to just enough. All right. Are there any questions on this whole midterm thing? Let's see. I found the essay prompt to be very vague. What was vague about the essay prompt?
It was just a little cryptic and like what exactly you were like wanting to like specific like requirements of things, because like the question of like what I don't know. Basically, I put in what I wrote, just that basically what I pulled from the prompt was basically a format of define the key terms,
Yep.
ground those terms in historical examples, and then have a little bit on why this analysis should be done.
Yeah, that's
And
it.
so
In other words, this isn't a term paper. All I'm trying to get you to do is demonstrate a functional mastery of the concepts. Okay, I now understand what this could be a working definition of either imperialism or colonialism. Here are the moving parts of it. Here's how I would model it. Here are some examples of that, either from what we talked about in class or what you've done in your readings, or I've encouraged you a few times. Look at this example or look at that example. You can Google it. I've done that a few times. And that's it. That's pretty straightforward. What I'm trying to do, Penny, is to allow people to work to their strength, okay, rather than really make the prompt so specific that it just may not be the way you think. It's possible that people are going to think differently about how they approach this assignment, and I'm trying to allow for that. At this level of your education as upper division students, you've got a way of going about doing things. I don't care what that way is, as long as the end result will allow you to, right, apply the assigned readings. Don't just talk. Apply the assigned readings, okay? And then I ask you, be sure to clarify your concepts. So that means when you use a term like imperialism, now you may not, we talked about this, you may not distinguish functionally between imperialism and colonialism. You might just say, well, colonialism is a facet of imperialism, or imperialism is the motive force that compels people to go out and colonize. That's fine. You've told me kind of what, for purposes of you going on with, you've told me that. Now you can get that from the readings. It's there, okay? What does it mean to have a colony? Well, you could go to Reinhardt and talk about alterity and development gap. You're occupying because you can. Why can you? You do it in part because of this notion of alterity. It's alien rule. They're not us. We don't feel as bad about governing them. And we have the capacity to do it. We have the Maxim gun and they have not. Whatever it is. Okay? So that, I don't mean it to be vague. What I wanted we've talked about this a little bit. I want you to be able to go from where you're most comfortable in starting this thing. But if you look at that, I don't know how I really could have been much more specific.
Okay, it could just be that I just don't have, I haven't really had to write many papers with like a more vague prompt. It's just that I don't have much, I only have experience with like more specific, whatever. I just wanted to make sure, like you're talking about like, oh, like there were a lot of these things that I didn't see in the paper, like when reading them, and like I didn't see this, I didn't see that, and I'm wondering like, oh, like should I have like known that like these were required like elements to touch on? Like I just wasn't sure where I was, like if I just missed something or if that was.
I don't know, because I don't have the text of your midterm in the front of my brain right now. But like, for example, the idea of the development gap or the notion of alterity. Those are things that I think I mentioned every class meeting. That would be an indication. You know what? Let me go back and look at those, because that sounds like that's pretty important. If you read Reinhardt and you read him, remember, we're talking about what, a 10-page chapter or something like that? It was really short.
Yeah.
If you read that, it's clear that he's telling you from page 1 on, if you really want to understand colonialism, you got to start with these two things, alterity, right? And development gap. Yeah, that would suggest to me, if Bill assigned that reading, and the author is that emphatic about these two things being important, and if we talked about it as we did repeatedly in class, that would suggest to me I probably should have that in there. And okay. Then if you think about colonialism, can you imagine colonialism happening without those things?
Mm.
So that's the way you would do it. I mean, again, it's sort of, in part, it's the difference between an upper division and a lower division class. In a lower division class, it might be more specific there, because it's just like, what does this word mean? At the upper division level, though, it's like, okay, fly with this a little bit. Okay. For example, if you didn't specifically say development gap, right? But maybe you invoked Reinhardt and you talked about something to do with, the advantage of the colonizer. You implied it in some way. I don't know quite how you would do that. But if you did that, I'm going to recognize it and it's going to be fine. Okay. Somebody else might be the kind who's very clinical about it and is just going to go through and say, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this, and you cite your sources and you're good to go. So there are different ways to do it. I don't want to imply that there's only one way to do it. But I've tried to emphasize certain things that are indispensable components of this analysis. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Does
Thank
that make
you.
sense?
I think part of it is just, this is one of the first like upper division classes I've ever like done. I'm only a sophomore, and so like it
Yeah,
could just
well,
be a matter of like
that's why it seems unusual to you. So what I'm saying is, if you're uncomfortable with that now, what I'm saying is that's cool. Rewrite it by Sunday if you want. Just tell me what you want to
Right.
tell me what you want to fix, and that's fine. What I don't want to do is create more pressure. Okay. Some of you aren't going to care. It's like some of you haven't been coming to class, who might be or might not be here now. I haven't looked at roll yet. And you didn't do any notes, and you clearly don't care. There's a couple of you who are in that camp. You know what? If you don't care, I won't worry about it. If you want to waste somebody's money and somebody's time and all that, your time, whatever, that's okay. I mean, whatever. I don't care. I mean, Quinn's got a giant frog. It's not going to disturb me. It's just, I don't care. But what I'm concerned about is someone who's really trying and really applies themselves and has the notes. And I looked at your notes and thought, you had this in the notes, but it didn't show up in your midterm. And a couple of you did that. I looked back at your notes, then I looked at your midterm, and it's like, are you guys talking to each other? That's what I'm concerned about. Okay. And sometimes it does take a second draft to do these things right. So what I'm suggesting is, if you want that opportunity, all you have to do is say, you know what, you don't have to tell me everything you're going to fix, but it's like, what I really need to work on? I need to be clearer about not only the economic motivation for empire, but the idea that it can give people military advantage. You know why I mentioned that? It'll become clearer now, even though we've mentioned it before. What breaks up colonies? Imperial war. That's what can weaken colonies. So this notion of global war, we've already talked about these different epics of colonialism and the expansions of empire and things like that, right? Every one of those is characterized by war. And when you have multiple empires aspiring to expand, you are going to get people throwing down and fighting. That's going to happen. Okay, so you might want to go back and revisit something like that. What you're trying to do, remember, it's not just that you're filling up space on a page with stuff that sort of sounds historical or political sciencey. It's that you're almost talking to yourself and telling yourself, okay, when I do my case study and I talk about colonialism, which I have to do before I talk about how it's resisted, here's the picture I want to have in my head, so that you can actually use your midterm as one of the frames of reference. You can remember, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot that thing, I wrote it on my midterm, and it's really important, and I got to make sure that when I do my case study, this notion of alterity is particularly important, because I'm going to look at Algeria and I'm going to apply multiple perspectives, right? And one of them is going to be Frantz Fanon. And the key element of Frantz Fanon, as some of you pointed out, is it's an alterity, but it isn't Marxist in the sense of class struggle. Okay, it isn't that class struggle isn't there. There is always class struggle, but it's the idea of race. That race was made to matter because restrictions were imposed and empowered based on race. Okay, well, that's a specific perspective. It derives from what Reinhardt, in this history of colonialism, calls alterity, alien rule. Yeah. I'm sorry, I have to. Do you want email or Zoom meetings? Email is sufficient. If you want to meet with me before you do it, absolutely, we can make time to do that. I just don't want to require it because I know you're all busy. You got other midterms coming up now and everything. But if you want to have a 20-minute meeting with me or something like that, especially on this Friday, I shouldn't say it because I'm going to jinx myself. But let me. This Friday is wide open for me. I'm not leaving town or anything. This would be a good day to do it. It would still leave you another really 2 days to rewrite the thing. So if you want to meet with me to talk about this, the only thing I have scheduled so far on Thursday. This is a light week in terms of class schedule, because most of it, that's right, because I got to grade stuff and I'm doing assessment, but that's okay. I can do that at night. The only thing I have on Thursday is this class. I'm usually up and doing and online at the very latest by 9 o'clock. Okay. I don't like to do anything much later than about 12:30 because I like to clear my head before class. And then I can also meet after class on Thursday, or pretty much any time that is convenient for you on Friday. So absolutely, if you want a Zoom meeting, I'm more than happy to do that. That a lot of times that's better, because we can, I can look at what you've written and we can deconstruct it a little bit. It's really hard for me to do that in writing. I think there's something wrong with my brain that doesn't allow me to do that, but I can talk through it with you. So I'm absolutely more than happy to do that with anybody who wants to do it. Now, I want to remind you of a couple things though. If you're comfortable with your midterm, you go back and you look at it, it's like, you know what? I mean, I could use a couple of examples, but I don't want to embarrass people. But there are a couple of you who you did fine. You just did fine. Okay. And I could tell you were going to do fine because I'd looked at your notes. Okay. So one of the things is, if your notes are thin, when you look back at those two summary things from module 1 and module 2, that's probably an indication that you didn't do very well. If your notes are not very well organized, that might be an indication, I got to take a harder look at this. If you threw verbiage out in kind of a word salad and weren't quite able to clarify that, as many of you did, in terms of clarifying concepts, that might be the thing you want to take on. I better make sure that Bill understands what I mean by imperialism or colonialism. I don't know that I really did that very well. But if you don't want to, if you're busy, if you're tired, whatever, it's just, it's not going to make or break whether or not you pass the class. Obviously, you have to pass your midterm to pass the class, but I'm not going to fail anybody, okay? I'm not going to fail anybody. But, there are some then that would have to default to a D, okay? Just because they're just not very good. There are a lot of C minuses. In other words, below average for what the realistic expectations of an upper division history or political science class. All right. Are there any other questions on the midterm? Because I really would like for us to break the label on module 3 and get into decolonization a little bit. Let's see. Are you free after this class to discuss my paper? Am I free after this class? That is a very good question. I didn't check for today. No, in fact, I am not. Yes, I am. If in fact, and I got to think about this. Sorry. Give me 1 second. I got to decide how crucial this is and whether or not I can reschedule it. Okay, I got that. Yeah, I better, because I can't do it tomorrow. So as soon as we're done, maybe stick around till everybody else logs off. Why don't we do that? We'll do that. Okay. Yeah, I'm still, like, my calendar, it just, sometimes I look at it and it's just this blur. I was like, ah, shit, what do I have to do today? All right, anything else about midterms? All right. Then let's go ahead. Let me get back over here. If you go to the magical Moodle site, first thing I want you to do is look at some of the statements or phrases or questions I'm framing there. If we look at, and we're pretty much now emphasizing Kennedy's book, okay? There are other things as well, but the core of this is going to be Dane Kennedy's work, because I actually think it's quite good. I do, though, think, I'm going to take issue with a few things. That doesn't mean it's not good work. One of the things that Kennedy points out that I wanted to walk through, this is the main thing I wanted to do today, is the idea where he says, he talks about, again, some of this is review, he talks about waves of decolonization. And the first of the modern waves of decolonization, right, begins in 1776 and carries through probably till about 1820 or thereabouts, because that's when we're dealing with the Caribbean and South America, okay? There's another one as a consequence of World War I that occurs. This is according to Kennedy, right? This should not come as a surprise. And then there's another one, obviously the one that we normally associate with the emergence of what we used to call the Third World. That's after the Second World War. And then he argues that there's a fourth wave. And what triggers that is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, now, the thing that we start with, always go back to this. What caused this? Why did it happen? So that means, things just don't get tired and wear out. They just don't. If you buy a pair of shoes and you don't use them and you put them in your closet, and I know people who do this, and they sit there, they're going to look brand new. They really are, because they're not getting any use. So things don't just suddenly magically wear out. What he argues is, if you look on page 5, right? Page 5, give you a page to look at. Oh, I gotta go back with you. Where what he's talking about is global war, the clash, these collisions of empires on a global scale. Okay? Because in the wake of, or as a consequence of these imperial wars, you find both motives and opportunities for decolonization. That's the point he's trying to make. Now, are there any questions about what he means there? Even if you, and some of you may not yet have had the chance to start Kennedy, but this is what I want you to look for when you get there, is the significance of these wars of empire, where empires collapse because, or they weaken because they collide in these wars. Now, historically, if this wave of decolonization begins in 1776, what caused it? Some of you are history majors. What caused it? What was going on in the world prior to that?
If we're going to talk about
What's the 7 Years' War?
The French and the British fighting again.
Well, fighting still. Okay, but remember, it's not just the French and the British. This is a world war. Okay, some of this is fought in West Africa. Some of it's fought in the New World. Some of it's fought in the Old World. A lot of it's fought at sea. These are the importance of the Atlantic, right? And it's this absolute collision. What are they fighting over? I'll give you a hint. What's the French and Indian War? Because that predates by about a year and is the older principal cause of the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War. What's that being fought over? Where is it being fought initially? Over what? No, it is not about slaves.
Canada.
Sorry, I heard
Trade.
you. Say again?
Trade. Trade.
No, it's not about trade.
I thought it was trade for
Nope.
trading.
Nope.
Land in the New World, right?
Land in the New World. Yes. Who's trying to grab more land in the New World?
The British and the French.
No, the British have it.
Okay, the French.
The French want it. The Spanish can't hang on to it. Okay, but you see, you have, in other words, you have these collisions of these empires. They're fighting over territory that they want to colonize. Because we already know by, say, 1754, right? We already know what an amazing place North America is. And think about this, really think about this, okay? You've got these pristine hardwood forests. One of the reasons why the American Navy was just better, we had these beautiful hardwood forests, and we could make these indestructible ships, okay? Well, you got these wretched Europeans coming over with the smallpox and everything, and they get here and they're like, look at those fucking trees, you know, and there are a lot of them, and they're ours. And the French are like, we want them too. We want the trees. They can climb them so very far, you know? And it's like, yeah, well, I'll kick your ass for these trees. You will not. Okay? But so you've got, this is not about trade. Now, does it have implications for trade, which might have been what that really meant? Does it have implications for trade? Yes, because there are resources and there are land routes. So of course it affects trade, but this is about the control of land as an empire projecting to control territory beyond its metropole, beyond its core. Fundamentally, this is a war caused by colonialism. Okay, remember when I talked about the scramble for Africa about a century, a little more than a century later? that was the purpose of the Berlin Conference, to try to rationalize that scramble for Africa to avoid another global war. Okay, so according to Kennedy's thesis then, you had these dislocations that were caused by what we here call the French and Indian War. So the French make alliances with a number of the Native American nations to help control that, to undermine, you know, the British with relatively little American colonial support, really, honestly, okay? They're fighting ground wars. What a lot of people didn't know was that American merchants living in the colonies, talking about trade, were actually facilitating commerce that was aiding both sides in that war. And they were making money. There was a lot of war profiteering. In addition to that, because that war led to the larger 7 Years' War, which was a truly global world war, okay, which was incredibly expensive, it broke the back of both imperial economies. The British were flat, as they often are, were flat broke. So they go to the colonies and say, we need to raise your taxes. And they passed what were called the Intolerable Acts, the various levels of the Stamp Act, tea tax, all that kind of stuff. Because what they're saying is, we fought a 7-year war here to protect you. You're going to have to pick up the tab. You're going to have to help us defray the cost of this. And clearly, that's a legitimate claim, right? Well, the American colonists, the merchants, said no, because that's going to cut into our profits. And this is where the idea of, yes, it affects trade. Even though the war itself was not directly about trade, ultimately it would have significant ramifications for trade. But also, it would signal the end of American colonialism. Because what we often are not taught in our little, you know, middle school and high school civics classes is, this was not an uprising of the American people, because they didn't really exist. This was fundamental resistance by the commercial class, largely in and around Boston. Okay? And what they wanted was more sovereign control of their commerce. They didn't want to pay taxes to Britain. You know, this whole idea of taxation without representation, most of America wasn't being directly taxed by, you know, by the British. And they were, whether you like it or not, being protected by the British. Were there abuses by the British Army? Of course there were. There always will be. Colonialism is violent. We know that, okay? But the fact is that the people who led that insurgency that became, you know, this so-called Revolutionary War, right? These were elites. But also, this is what's hard for us to understand. And this is what I think, in a way, Kennedy kind of misses. In that first wave of decolonization, those weren't the colonized who were rebelling. Those were the colonizers. Even if they'd been there for generations, they were the colonizers largely. In other words, their economic connections, their cultural ties were overwhelmingly with the colonizer. They identified with the colonizer. Remember, Declaration of Independence denied their rights as Englishmen, as colonizers, okay? And that's important, because suddenly they saw, you know, as a consequence of this 7 Years' War and the 9-year French and Indian War here, right? The British Empire is weak, it's vulnerable. Clearly, its ability to govern the colonies is weakening, it's overstretched. We have an opportunity. We have a motive, right? We want to maximize this increasingly lucrative trade that we have with the West Indies, for example, and things like that, you know, supporting their slave plantations and things like that. We have an opportunity to become wealthy. But we can't do that if the Brits keep intervening and you know, stopping us and, you know, sequestering, you know, blocking our harbors, sequestering our you know, our cargo, taxing us on all this stuff. Now remember, most of America, most of the, you know, the colonials at that time were not directly affected by this at all. It took a long time to rev up popular support for this. Thank Thomas Paine for that, among other people. But this is an important point. The American people had to be revved up. All right. And in addition to that, and this is Kennedy points this out, another opportunity was facilitated by the fairly rapid departure of about 100,000 English loyalists who did not want to separate. So imagine, that's a very large migration. Some of you pointed out in your discussions of colonialism and colonization, the phenomena that we associate with that included migration, significant migration of people from the metropole to the periphery, from the core to the periphery, and so on. All right, that's important, okay? But as an opportunity structure, and we talked about that, as an opportunity for the decolonization of America was, once the violence starts and the shots are fired, very quickly you have colonials turning on colonials on the basis of whether or not they're still loyal to the crown. Okay, and those who were the loyalists, the Tories, the loyalists, a lot of them went to Canada. A lot of them hopped on ships, went back to London, stayed in England. Okay, that just clears the decks. It makes it easier to mobilize a sustained insurgency because you don't have very much indigenous resistance to that. The people just leave. Now, in a lot of cases, they left with the idea that ultimately Britain would prevail and they'd come back and get their property back. So a lot of them were just dispossessed of their property. Okay, but you see where we're going here. In other words, I'm trying to use the so-called American Revolution to illustrate the point that Kennedy's making. It wouldn't have happened at that time had it not been for the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts wouldn't have happened had it not been for the 7 Years' War or the 9-year French and Indian War, because it wouldn't have been necessary. And who knows how much long, what likely was going to happen, I can tell you. It looks like, and I'm reading Edmund Burke here. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think actually Kennedy mentions Burke. But I was pulled out a book of mine of some of the essays about Burke and some of his writings. His idea was give them full English citizenship. In other words, create an actual international, like an imperial parliament, and give them representation. He was one of the people who, however reluctantly, was talking about that, because what he was trying to avoid was this violent separation, because he could see what was going to happen, and it did, right? So when you're thinking about this and again, please, I admonished you, do not use the United States as an example, in part because, strictly speaking, you don't have the colonized carrying out the insurgency. You have colonials. And I think the difference is important. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't be counted as colonialism, but I'm going to suggest, and Kennedy doesn't quite emphasize this to my satisfaction, that's a distinct era of colonialism where even when you go down into South America, for example, right? If you look at, for example, the May Revolution in Argentina, that's what, I think I have it written down. I can't remember. I think it's 1810. I can't remember. Okay. That revolution is not carried out by the indigenous people of what became those countries. Those are all colonials. And what they're trying to do, they have the opportunity, because of renewed war between the colonial empires, and the Dutch Republic has to come rumbling in, right? I think that was about 1780. It's like, oh yeah, we're ready too, And so everybody's got their vessels out fighting, and they're plundering, and they got privateers and all. It's a fascinating history. I love that history. Okay. But the people in a lot of these South American colonies are thinking, this is our chance, man. We can put together, they tried to put together these alliances that would have combined what now are separate countries. Some of them were created, they couldn't hold together. But it's because the indigenous colonial aspirants, elites, aspirants to power, were able to displace these colonial administrations or kill them or run them out because they were weakened. You couldn't send a big garrison, to what became Argentina or what became, Brazil or whatever, because you were fighting a war. The Portuguese lost their colonial possessions to Spain at one point in this constant warfare. And then you have, of course, you have the Napoleonic Wars. And, Napoleon's going and invading, Spain and saying, aha, dispossessing, the king of Spain. So you have an offshore monarch going where? To the colony. So that's why I say, when we think of South America in particular, these are not generationally indigenous people rebelling against a colonizer. These are colonizers fighting for sovereignty. That is not what we would see after the Second World War. Okay, that's a different kind of decolonization. And again, we can talk about exactly why it's different, but the main thing is, when you look at Southeast Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, these are generationally indigenous people rejecting imposed alien colonial rule. That's different from what we saw in what became the United States, or what became Canada, or what became South America and Central America. The closest you have to that probably, if something like that, would probably be Haiti. We're right in the midst of the early stages of the French Revolution. You had a slave revolt, Toussaint Louverture, who led this slave revolt and declared independence. It held for a while, and then it fell apart, and it held for a while. But that involved indigenous Haitians to some extent, especially if you can count liberated slaves as indigenous, which, is hard to say. So does that make sense, first of all, that, what Kennedy's saying is the catalytic event that can yield opportunities for decolonization is war between empires. Okay.
So a quick question.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes me think back to Reinhardt. Is the idea that these are all settlement colonies, that all these colonies have pushed out most or all of the indigenous people, and so the only people left to rebel are your Englishmen? Does that make
Pretty
sense?
much, yes.
Okay.
In
so
that
like this-
wave of decolonization, even though Kennedy doesn't, and I'm not dissing Kennedy, it's just that I wish he had specified that a little bit, that era of decolonization is peculiar by the degree to which those settlement colonies had become functionally permanent. Those people weren't going anywhere. Yeah, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I was wondering, like,
Yes.
if I was going to categorize it in Reinhardt's work, it would be.
Yes, and I think that's how it would tie back to Reinhardt. Yes,
Okay.
that's a good point.
I was just making sure I was right in that, because if I was wrong, I was like, I'm gonna.
No, I think you're making a great point, and I quite honestly had not thought to mention that. And so that's helpful. But this is so for those of you, by the way, and a couple of you have mentioned this. Sorry, I just had a glitch in my system. There we go. So that's an automatic scanning thing that kicked in. So hopefully I picked up a virus. Anyway, some of you wanted to do a case study from South America, for example. That's one of the things I would ask you to keep in mind. It doesn't mean you can't use it, but it doesn't necessarily make a good comparison with the kind of post-World War II decolonization, for the reason that I hope I've explained. Okay? Are there any questions about that? Okay. So, if you're going to be looking at that first wave of decolonization, you need to look at either the French and Indian War in North America, or you need to look at the 7 Years' War. You then need to look at the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and then everything that was a follow-up to that. Because the Napoleonic Wars functionally end right around 18. See, then you get the War of 1812, which is an extension of the Napoleonic Wars, right? But that's why he said it kind of resolves by about 1820. So there's always a little spillover effect where there's still, some opportunity. People are trying to make settlements. They're trying to make peace. They're trying to pay war debts. They're trying to make things right. Okay. And so following Kennedy, if we wanted to explain that first generation of decolonization, the opportunity structures would involve a relatively constant state of regional and global warfare between imperial powers. Okay? That's the main thing I wanted to cover today to get you going on that. So if you're reading the introduction to Kennedy, and I would say up through probably, just trying to be specific about this. Yeah, chapter 1 is, it talks about the different waves more specifically, but that first wave of decolonization, that's what he's talking about. Okay. So what I'd like to do is, I think the best thing to do, notwithstanding our midterms, I'm trying not to overload you for those of you who might really want to do extensive rewrites on your midterm. What I would ask you to do though is, I would say get into, let me see where you'd want to get to before next class. I just want to see if there is right here. Oh yeah, read up through chapter 1, okay? And on chapter 2 is global wars, colonial consequences. And we talk about imperial war and things like that. We'll be building on this argument, but at least get the introduction in chapter 1 done before Thursday, if you want to stay current, okay? Now, in addition to that, there is this decolonization, the short history. I'm leaving that for you as an option right now. It's there, don't worry about it. The same thing with the book on revolutions. Some of you, what you're looking at, you may find is also involves actual revolution. That is, there is an ideological doctrine in state or something like that. So you might, I'm using that, you know, where you might say, hey, you know, you might want to, if you're doing that kind of revolutionary transformation, right? Maybe you should look at that. And then there's this brief article, it's from the, I think the Stanford Philosophical Encyclopedia on this concept of negritude. The reason why I included that is that was an intellectual, despite its kind of silly sounding name, it was an intellectual catalyst for a lot of these sort of elites in the intellectual and artistic elites, people like Fanon, for example, to find common identity as non-white colonized people, okay? And so it matters. It matters for, obviously, Cesar Sangor was one of the architects of negritude. Nkrumah was very much involved in that, especially if you're using any example of post-World War II sub-Saharan Africa. You might want to look at that article. But those are just kind of supporting materials, depending on what kind of work you're going to be doing. I'm trying to just get a variety of things there. But the main thing I want you to focus on here is Kennedy's book. Okay, if you do nothing else, we'll do Kennedy's book. All right, are there then any other questions, either on the midterm or on what we talked about today? Does it make sense, the idea of, you know, what Kennedy's trying to do here? He's not just saying, well, these are all these popular uprisings and they just kind of happen every once in a while. He's saying, no, there's a pattern we can see in history and it repeats. All right. Then I would say, let me stop recording